The meeting between Trump and Zelensky has concluded. Is there a chance for peace? We'll talk about this with David Tafuri, international lawyer and former US State Department official. David, glad to see you and thank you for joining us.
Great to see you. Thanks for having me on again.
David, meeting between the presidents of Ukraine and the US at the Davos Economic Forum. The meeting concluded after 1 hour. Trump said the meeting with Zelensky was successful and sent a message to Russian dictator Vladimir Putin: the war must end. What concrete outcomes were achieved during the meeting between Trump and Zelensky, in your opinion, and your own expectations?
Well, just the fact that the meeting happened is good, because it wasn't clear until yesterday that the meeting would happen, and President Trump said he would be meeting with President Zelensky today. And the fact that President Zelensky was willing to come suggests he thought it would be fruitful and productive for him to come. But as far as we know, Russia and Putin have not changed their demands for a ceasefire since the very beginning of the war. And so until we get credible evidence that shows that Putin is going to bargain in good faith, I remain skeptical there's actually going to be a real peace agreement that results in lasting peace and security for Ukraine.
David, and Steve Witkoff, yes, President Donald Trump's special envoy, stated he is satisfied after a meeting with the Ukrainian delegation in Davos, adding that talks on ending the Russian-Ukrainian war are at the final stage. What does final stage mean in the context of these negotiations? What are the main obstacles remaining before a potential agreement is reached?
The biggest obstacles are territory. Russia is demanding that Ukraine give up all of the 4 provinces that it has illegally annexed, even though Ukrainian forces have bravely been able to defend parts of those provinces and do not want to give them up. And also, it's security guarantees, both security guarantees from countries that are allies of Ukraine, like the US, UK, France, Germany, but also how those security guarantees will play out. Will they result in European countries, which have said they are willing to do it, sending soldiers into Ukraine in order to monitor the border and ensure that the ceasefire is observed and complied with by Russia? Putin has resisted agreeing to any of those things. And until we see progress and a suggestion from Putin that he's willing to make concessions on those issues, I remain skeptical, despite what Witkoff says, that there could actually be a peace agreement. And remember, Witkoff has said in the past, we are close, and then negotiations broke down over these issues, and because Putin is not being reasonable.
And about potential creation of a duty-free zone with Ukraine, President Donald Trump is considering establishing a duty-free zone with Ukraine, according to special envoy Steve Witkoff. Witkoff noted that such a zone would support industrial development during Ukrainians' post-war recovery. How would a duty-free zone impact Ukrainians' post-war economic recovery? What potential challenges or risks could arise in creating the duty-free zone?
Well, there are some potential upsides from having a duty-free zone. That could be a place where there's a focus on investment. And of course, we're talking about the areas of Donbass that are, very heavy in manufacturing and also have substantial natural resources. So for those to be exploited in a proper way with professional companies helping do that would be a positive for the region. But on the other hand, it would be very difficult to manage Russia and Russia's interference in that duty-free zone. You can imagine that Russia and Putin would try to take control of that duty-free zone, would interfere in any self-governance that happened there. And so I'm not convinced that Russia would be a fair player in respect to its interactions with such a duty-free zone.
Witkoff and Jared Kushner to visit Moscow. U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff stated that on Thursday, together with Jared Kushner, they will travel to Moscow to meet with Russian dictator Vladimir Putin. Witkoff also said he would soon visit Kiev. When asked about the timing of his visit to Ukraine, he replied, soon. How could these visits impact ongoing negotiations to end the war, and how likely is it that Witkoff will visit Kiev? About possibility.
Well, Witkoff and Jared Kushner have been spending a lot of time in Moscow. And in many ways, because they've spent so much time there and they've met so many times with Putin and his other advisors, they seem to be influenced by the Russian perspective. And so I think it's very good that Witkoff has said he's going to go to Kyiv and maybe right after the Moscow trip so he can hear the Ukrainian perspective. And I think he needs to spend more time in Kyiv. We don't have a U.S. ambassador in Ukraine, so it's all up to Witkoff. He's the main person that President Trump is relying upon to give him good information about Ukraine, about the situation, about the war. And so for Witkoff to spend more time in Ukraine will make him better informed and more capable of giving good advice to the president.
And David, also about Trump's Davos speech on Europe's economy, Trump criticized the modern trajectory of the European economy, saying the continent has faced a decline over the last decade due to excessive government intervention and migration policies. How accurate is Trump's assessment of Europe's economic challenges, and what is the primary challenge in EU-US relations now?
Every region has economic challenges, and President Trump is right that there are problems in Europe. But if you want to look at continents that have problems, there are other continents with much bigger problems, like Latin America, like Africa. And I'm not sure I understand why President Trump is so obsessed with criticizing Europe. And keep in mind, we have problems back here in the United States. And I think President Trump should worry less about what's happening in Europe and more about what's happening here in the United States. And in particular, he needs to recognize that the countries in Europe have been longtime allies of the United States. They defended the United States when we were attacked on 9/11. That's the only time that Article 5 of the NATO Charter has been invoked. And he should keep that in mind, too. They have not always agreed with us, but they've been good allies, and we're going to need them as allies in the future. I'm glad there's been some progress on the Greenland issue, according to what President Trump said yesterday, because that has created a wedge between the United States and Europe, and that needs to be resolved, I think, for Europeans to feel more comfortable with the relationship with the United States.
And Trump highlighted the situation in Latin America, stating that Washington effectively controls Venezuela's energy resources following the recent overthrow of Nicolas Maduro. The U.S. has reportedly collected 50 million barrels of oil for sale and use. What impact does this control have on global oil markets, and what is happening in Venezuela right now?
Well, when President Trump says he controls the Venezuelan oil sector, I think it's important to really focus on what he means, because we don't have troops on the ground in Venezuela. We don't have American companies running the oil sector in Venezuela. So it's a bit misleading. What he means is that when there are oil shipments out of Venezuela, we are either taking them by force or by agreement with Venezuela. We are helping them get sold. We're taking part of those proceeds. And I guess that's going to benefit the United States in some ways. It raises lots of international law questions about whether that's legal and what compensation is owed to Venezuela. And I would also suggest that there's not been a long-term plan put forward for governance in Venezuela. And if we do not focus more on Venezuela, it's not clear to me that Delcy Rodriguez, who's the acting president now because Maduro has been taken to the United States to be tried for crimes. It's not clear to me it's going to change any. And I'm also not convinced that without U.S. troops on the ground, Venezuela is going to be a better friend or ally to the United States. So we take their oil, but we don't actually have any control over the country itself. And more importantly, we don't have the ability to leverage Venezuela into becoming a democratic country, into having elections, into having free markets. Those are the things that are in the interests of the United States vis-a-vis Venezuela.
Trump on new military technologies, Trump stated that the world has entered a new era of armaments where a single missile could destroy everything. And in your opinion, what message is Trump sending with these statements, or with his statements about new military technologies, and who is the intended audience?
Well, he's right about that. And, he should recognize that Ukraine is now one of the leading countries in developing innovative defense technologies. And Ukraine is going to be a very important ally for the United States and Europe because it's going to be the most battle-tested army in the world other than Russia. And it's going to have innovative weapons that have been tested on the battlefield. And they're going to have a lot of data about how their weapons and weapon systems and defensive systems work. And so the United States and Europe are in some ways behind on drone technology and anti-drone defenses. So I think that's part of what he's referring to. The United States needs to catch up, and it would be wise for us to do so by working closely with Ukraine and sharing technology with them and having them share technology with us.
You mentioned Greenland, and Donald Trump emphasized that his interest in Greenland is purely strategic, not resource-based, describing it as hardly land, just a large piece of ice with no important minerals to extract. How does Trump's description reflect U.S. strategic priorities in the Arctic?
Well, he's been consistent about that he believes that the U.S. needs Greenland for our own security interests and to maintain global order. But as we talked about in the past, I believe that the better pathway is to perhaps get an agreement from Denmark and Greenland that gives the United States all of the rights and permissions it needs for its military to operate freely in and around Greenland, and new basing rights and new details on what those basing rights mean. And those should be long-term agreements that assure the United States that going far into the future, we will have the access to Greenland that we need. Were we to get that, it's not clear to me why we would also need for Greenland to become part of the United States. If the goal is to have better access to Greenland for security purposes, we can get that without acquiring Greenland.
The New York Times reports that the U.S. and NATO are considering a Cyprus scenario for Greenland. The island remains under Danish control, but the U.S. may build military bases similar to the British bases in Cyprus. What do you think about this?
I think that's a good compromise. And President Trump said yesterday that they've reached some sort of agreement, but the details on that agreement have not been made clear. But it could be along the lines of what you just suggested and what I said in my last answer, which is greater permissions that are secured for the United States and the U.S. military and freedom of movement, but without Greenland actually changing hands in terms of who owns it and it becoming part of the United States.
For the first time in 100 years, Canada simulated actions in case of a U.S. military invasion. The exercise assumed that American forces could capture key Canadian positions on land and at sea within a week, possibly in just 2 days. What prompted Canada to model a potential U.S. invasion scenario?
Well, I don't know for sure, but I can only assume it's both the fact that President Trump has been suggesting he wants to take Greenland, which is very close to Canada, and he has in the past said that he wants Canada to be the 51st state, and he's said that many times, that he believes Canada would benefit from joining the United States. So I imagine that's why Canada did that. It's a very sad state of affairs when one of our closest allies and closest trading partners feels like it has to simulate defenses against a potential U.S. invasion. I do not think the U.S. is going to invade Canada. I cannot imagine that scenario playing out, but I understand why Canada feels nervous and paranoid about it.
About Peace Council for Gaza, at Davos, 19 countries signed the Statute of the Peace Council created to resolve the conflict in the Gaza Strip. Trump said that the Council will unite over 50 countries with him as its head. The Council's emblem features only America. as we saw. What is the primary mission of the Peace Council?
I really don't know. This is a brand new concept that's never been raised before, except in the last few weeks. I don't know who the planners are for it. I imagine it's partly a way to get around some of the problems that the UN has, the fact that the UN is often blocked from taking action by the fact that two of the permanent Security Council members, China and Russia, block a lot of reasonable solutions that the Security Council would like to pursue. So perhaps it is that, but it would not have the same legal legitimacy and imprimatur that the UN has. And I can't imagine it having that unless there were, agreements among the biggest countries in the world to use this peace board in that manner. The other part of what the proposal is a way to raise money. And if we are raising money by charging countries $1 billion to be part of this peace council, and that money is used to rebuild and reconstruct Gaza, that part of it would be a good thing. It's an imaginative way to raise funds that are going to be necessary for the reconstruction of Gaza. Perhaps they could be used in Ukraine as well.
So the Peace Council's global mandate extends to the war in Ukraine, right? Because the newly created Peace Council is planned to operate not only in Gaza, but also in other regions worldwide, according to Trump's special envoy, Witkoff.
That's right. But I think he's invited Russia to be part of the Peace Council. And so as soon as you have Russia in a council and it has voting rights, or it's not clear how the processes will work, you can imagine that Russia is going to block anything productive that it would do in Ukraine.
Mr. Tafuri, thank you so much for this important and interesting conversation. As always, thanks for supporting Ukraine and Ukrainian people. David Tafuri, international lawyer and former US State Department official, was with us today. Please share this interview and continue supporting Ukraine. Thank you so much again, and see you.
Thank you. Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава.